Old Archsire Magoro spent his days mostly alone. Most, if not all, of his children had departed their old house, and now even their children visited seldomly. Of his broods and broodmothers, none remained in the old manor with him, and even his servants and attendants had been reassigned after he sent them away. Magoro found a quiet tranquility in solitude, and had resolved to live out the rest of his life cataloguing his thoughts in a memoir as old as he was, and sipping exquisitely aged Satiroi ink from his stock in the cellar. Now, watching the star this planet orbited sinking lazily down below the horizon, he lounged on the sunning bench atop the tallest spire of the manor. From here, the dizzying height sprouted up from the waves below, and exposed his slippery, amphibious body to the gentle warmth of the sunset. It was his favorite spot, one which reminded him acutely of his youth and glorious ancestry. In years past, he had been a bold historian, seeking out the truths hidden in the fables about his famous lineage, and compiling great volumes tattooed on blubbery sheets with his carving quill pen. A pen which, these days, lay gently in a bed of coral in his study, cleaned daily by tiny microorganisms to keep it as good as new. Magoro contemplated his many adventures across the stars, eyes shut, temporal fins wagging raised in an expression of contentment before the explosive entrance of Avali shook him from his reverie.
Archsire Magoro! Archsire Magoro!
The young nautical sapien chirped frantically as she rounded the steps leading up to his sunning porch and stopped to catch her breath. Avali, here to visit, I see, unannounced as usual. I don't suppose you thought to speak to your sire before coming to see me? Avali pouted, her temporal fins shuddering with resentment and injured pride.
Archsire, the other children in the school have been talking out of turn again. They told me that our subspecies was descended from dumb animal savages. They said that's why I'm so fat and blubbery. They called you a senile old fish who still believes in the old legends about our ancestors. They keep laughing at me, Archsire. I hate them.
Magoro fluttered his temporal fins reassuringly, and sitting up from his perch, he offered his firstborn's third a quick stroke across the cheek with the longest of 7 fingers in a comforting show of affection. My girl, do you know why those other children speak so unkindly to you? Avali's temporal fins curled, and she straightened them with a sniffle.
Why?
The barest hints of expectant joy showing in her expression. Magoro leaned back, temporal fins shuddering wryly. It is because they are afraid. Afraid of your power and cunning, young Avali. Afraid because of the pedigree of our subspecies' ancient progenitors.
The humans,
Avali whispered excitedly. She knew the stories by heart that Archsire Magoro was about to tell her, but it always excited her to hear it again. While the sun slowly set, and the world grew dark around them, Avali sat beside her Archsire's sunning bench, and curled her 4 prehensile hind limbs beneath her. Magoro leaned forwards. We will start at the beginning, when the hegemony first discovered the humans, and the legendary War for Terra. The humans were a young race when the hegemony discovered the signs of intelligent life on their planet. They had only just barely taken the first steps towards interstellar travel, and when the hegemony realized how far in advance their technology was, they realized that Terra, the human homeworld, was ripe for the taking. The humans, for their part, had seen the alien ships the moment they had entered their solar system, and while they seemed happy enough to welcome their visitors as honored guests, they were wary. Weapons stockpiled, soldiers trained and prepared for the possibility of war, and the scientists study our technology as extensively as could be allowed. Unlike our leaders, the pure-blood Nautilans, humans had evolved to walk about on the landmass of their planet, and the high gravity of their homeworld had left them sturdy and physically imposing. Among much of the hegemony's subspecies, there was great fear of these savage creatures. Worse yet, their technology was based around combustion, a concept mostly foreign to our ocean-dwelling leaders and their subspecies. Relations quickly grew strained as the hegemony offered the humans a place among them, and explained how they would be interbred with pure-blood Nautolan families to create a brand new fusion of all the best qualities of the two races. Hegemony politicians and negotiators had made the pitch thousands of times, explained all the advantages of the union on 1,000 worlds to 1,000 different species. Oftentimes a well-crafted advertisement and a brief show of force were all it took for a world and its people to submit. But Terra was different. Humans, you see, had a strange and fascinating culture, and pride in their identity was a large part of it. They steadfastly refused to be bred out of existence, not even when it was shown how the union of human and Nautolan biology will create a wholly superior race. Tensions rose. The hegemony threatened to use force to coerce them into compliance, and the humans responded with a formal declaration of war. The war itself was the most terrible ever recorded in the history of the hegemony. Our ships and weapons were far superior to those of our human ancestors, and yet the humans were physically more powerful. No subspecies of Nautolan, no matter what characteristics they bore, could match the humans for their strength, speed, and raw ferocity. On the landmass that made up the majority of their civilizations, they moved and fought with practiced and methodical precision, and their soldiers were fueled with a primal, vicious hatred for invaders. For nearly 30 solar cycles on that little planet, the war raged, neither side ever truly managing to gain the upper hand for long. Just when our human ancestors began to drive off the hegemony forces, reinforcements from Nautor would arrive, and yet no matter how many ships and warriors were hurled at them, the humans fought with unprecedented fury. Their combustion-based technology and weapons terrified the hegemony, and even their civilians, females and elderly, even mere children would fight to the death if pressed. Their entire race stank of warlike pride, and they refused to bend or break as the war raged on.
And those were our direct ancestors. Yes, Archsire?
Avali interrupted excitedly. Indeed, the humans did eventually lose the war, but not for the reasons they teach you in Skola. The Fall of Terra.
Avali sat, drowsy and bored as her instructor droned on and on about history she had already learned 1,000 times before. Her old Archsire Magoro, may he rest forevermore, had done a better job teaching her than this foolish Nautolan, and Avali's temporal fins flared with barely suppressed irritation as the instructor got fact after fact about the war for Terra wrong.
You see, students, the humans, despite their barbarous nature and near boundless numbers, had no real intelligence, and where the war lasted for 34 solar cycles, it was only because of our hegemony's reluctance to destroy them that they lasted as long as they did.
Avali raised up a forelimb Majoris questioningly and saw with satisfaction how her instructor glowered at her. This would be the 4th time in this lesson alone that she would be correcting him.
Yes, Avali, what is it now?
He grumbled. According to the historical records unearthed and documented by archaeohistorian Magoro, the humans only lost the war because of the hegemony's propaganda, making them believe we had a weapon capable of breaking apart the planet. The instructor's hide rippled a deep and unpleasant orange, expressing his distaste at being corrected again. He curled his pneumotocists irritably and swam with quick, precise undulations to where Avali sat at her terminal.
I understand that your Archsire was something of an expert on the humans, young one, but the last time I checked, you were not the instructor of this lesson.
Avali met his petulant gaze steadily and replied evenly, Hegemony anthropologists and the archaeohistoric community verified my Archsire's findings in Cycle 66539 of the homeworld of Nautil. That the Hegemony had no trouble defeating humanity was determined as propaganda of the time. Her instructor's hide went an even darker shade of orange, and Avali wondered if her sire was going to be receiving another message regarding disruptive behavior.
Very well,
he hissed.
As you seem to be the expert on the history of your ancestors, why don't you teach the rest of the lesson? and inform your sire to expect another message regarding your disruptive and disrespectful behavior."
No disrespect intended, Instructor Navan. Avali ducked her head apologetically, but still rose from her terminal and swam to the front of the room. As Instructor Navan stated, humanity did lose the war with the hegemony, but it was not due to military victory over them. In fact, based on archaeological evidence on Terra, it has been found that the humans possess the means, resources, and morale to repel the third wave assault and force the hegemony to give up their conquest. In terms of martial and tactical prowess, the humans were experienced and warlike. They had practiced war with their own kind for thousands of solar cycles, and human culture dictated that they would fight until their very last breath. It was the hegemony's propaganda and political machine that broke the humans and led their world's leaders and politicians to surrender. Lies and misinformation seeded by the hegemony's counterintelligence department led the humans to believe that we had far more ships and warriors at our disposal than we did, as well as a seismic device that could rupture their planet's core and extinguish all life. Eventually, believing that their cause was hopeless, Terra's leaders surrendered and ordered their troops to stand down. There was resistance. Millions of humans refused to lay down their arms, and fighting continued on the surface of the planet for another 10 cycles while the hegemony began the selective breeding process. This was when Terra fell and began what many would later refer to as
the Rape of Terra.
The tour guide spotted Avali from the front of the crowd of onlookers and bared his square teeth in an expression of gladness and mirth. Avali had visited Terra, primordial homeworld of the humans, a number of times. Often she had taken this very same tour, and over the cycle she had grown from adolescence into adulthood. The tour guide, a nautical sapien much like herself, had clearly noticed her budding maturity and the attractive swell of her tertiary sexual characteristics. Avali didn't mind the occasional ogle, especially the adorable way the poor fellow tried to politely hide his stares. It was funny that the tour guide must have convinced himself that she continued visiting Terra to see him, when in reality it was the history of their human ancestors that she was really interested in. Her whole life, Avali had studied humanity with a fervor unmatched by her peers. Old Archsire Magoro had inspired her to follow the old legends to their source and become an archaeohistorian just like him. At present, she was on leave from her apprenticeship to one Agog Agor, the leading expert in the study of human culture and history, and she had decided a vacation to her favorite historical landmark on Terra was in order. The city was an ancient ruin on the banks of a great freshwater lake, a huge body of fluid composed of frigid hydronium and populated by a host of unintelligent aquatic life. According to her research on ancient human languages and runes, the faded and oxidized metal signs all around the city ruins marked it as a place called Chicago. It was part of a landmass on the western hemisphere of the planet that had fought back fiercely against the hegemony, and even when the politicians had surrendered, the citizens and countryfolk of this land had fought to their very last breath against the invaders. The tour guide was droning on as they rode on the back of the lumbering, flat-backed quadruped upon which the tour was taken. It was a domesticated descendant of some long-dead beast native to Terra, and the canopied seats and fresh fluid meant to keep the passengers cool and hydrated made the ride a comfortable one. A second beast stomped along behind them with the second tour group, and Avali took the time to familiarize herself with the sad story of the Rape of Terra. The tour guide went on.
When the hegemony took over, humans who were too old to reproduce were left to live out the rest of their lives watching their race die out. Those who were fertile but had already borne offspring were forcibly separated from partners and children, and assigned Nautilid breeding partners to live with. The Nautilid occupiers, for their part, were tasked with adopting certain human customs and facets of their cultures, which have survived since then as many of the courtship rituals we enjoy today. Humans were an emotionally open and expressive people, and many of the interspecies couples proved to be happy together. Nautil sapien offspring of these romances, similar to myself in appearance and physiology, were taken into the care of the government as wards of the hegemony, and while the last of the human resistances were quelled by force, human civilization was slowly adopted into our own over the next 200 solar cycles. Legends, of course, tell of a secret human rebellion that managed to escape the grip of the hegemony and flee into the stars, but as I'm sure you're all aware, no evidence exists to back up those claims.
Avali was aware. all too aware of the myths regarding the prophesied return of the humans and the apocalyptic vengeance they would wreak upon the hegemony for the destruction of their home. Her Archsire Magoro had steadfastly believed in the older ends, and had wasted his youth searching for any evidence that such a hidden human ship had existed. The aim was ridiculously unlikely. Human technology had barely scratched the surface of space travel before the war began. The idea that by its end they had devised a means of sustained spaceflight and survival in a vacuum was completely untenable, and to try to justify such a myth was detrimental to their understanding of history as it was. Despite herself, Avali couldn't help but think along the same lines as her Archsire, steadfastly hoping that their progenitor still existed out there somewhere among the stars. It was a foolish notion, of course, and yet she couldn't stop herself wistfully dreaming of the day she would find them, the day that would go down in history as
the recovery of man.
Avali hovered the biodrone over the milky dust of the satellite orbiting Terra, surveying the shattered ground and the upward jutting stones that were left over from the earthquake that had rocked the surface of this place only a few hours prior. The earthquake was the first exciting thing to have happened in her 4 solar cycles stationed here as a geological surveyor, collecting samples of the peculiarly composed strata of the satellite and analyzing them atom by atom. She had cherished the job when first it was assigned to her, but now was wondering if the Archaeohistorian Society had not simply used it as an opportunity to get rid of her. Much like Magoro before her, many found her insistent and dedicated research on mythic humanity to be a fool's errand. Day by day, her excitement had faded until now, the very real chance of death and celestial catastrophe only served as a momentary distraction from the monotony of day-to-day life on the base. It was a squat structure, hexagonal with branching corridors leading to the hab units for each of the team members, and a communal area in the hub. The team itself consisted of 6 different Nautilin subspecies, and not a single pure Nautilin among them. According to their superiors, this backwater nothing of a satellite wasn't important enough to warrant the attention of one of the scions of the hegemony. Avali was the only Nautil sapien, and as such, the only amphibious member of the team. Icthoc, a Nautil Carrot, was the head security officer on the team, and while Avali's human ancestry lent her a more powerful physical frame, Icthoc was outfitted with proper combat and riot control gear, including a nerve gun powerful enough to send her into muscular spasms, and seam armor that boosted his physical capabilities to nearly twice their standard for his subspecies. He had also spent cycle after cycle studying close quarters fighting, and Avali was decently confident that if he put his mind to it, he could kill her without much difficulty. Barrim was their communications expert, giving reports on the status of the base and almost always including some dry witticisms to convey his displeasure with being assigned here. In recent cycles, the hegemony had expanded significantly, and a new campaign of armed conflict had begun against a newly discovered species of feathered aviary alien on a low-gravity gaseous planet. Barrim had hoped to be sent to the front lines on the crew of a great battleship, and instead had been relegated here. The Nautil Gastrapo's disappointment seemed to seep into any and everything he spoke about, and Avali found his company to be something of a mood killer. Arte was a Nautil Rattus, one of the only mammalian subspecies of Nautilin, and despite the stereotypes, Avali had always found her to be polite, hardworking, and stunningly beautiful. The shining brown hair covering Arte's body was always groomed exquisitely, and she kept her claws and whiskers neatly trimmed. Arte was the team's resident geologist, and while she enjoyed a good party, she knew how to put work before pleasure and did her job admirably. The Nautil Rattus was a noisy, flamboyant, and showy housemate, and seemed to be courting a different male of her subspecies every time they went on leave. In truth, Avali envied her confidence and lithe, slim figure that seemed to glide on 4 slender limbs as she walked. Yngram and Bolston were a paired couple, and despite having different jobs and separate quarters on the base, often spent their sleep cycles together. They were both Nautil Brachia, of course. No one was permitted to breed outside of their subspecies. Yngram was the pilot in charge of ferrying the team off of the moon when they went on leave, as well as programming the pilotless drones that would bring back the samples of their work and data back to the Archaeohistorian Society on the planet of Cust 3875. Brash and uneducated, he worked little and complained often, making all but his partners sick of him within the first few rotations of the moon around the planet below. Bolston was the cook, and to say that she worked the hardest of anyone on the crew was no exaggeration. With limited materials, she was required to prepare daily meals for 5 different subspecies of nautilin, all with different dietary needs, and also try to keep every meal different so as to not stagnate the palate. Her good-natured attitude and brilliance in the galley was one of the only contributing factors for why no one had requested Yngram be transferred off the base. Lose the loudmouth pilot, and they would lose the only thing that made life worth living on this accursed rock. Avali was shaken out of her thoughts as she spied something beneath her in the tangled jumble of broken moonstone. A sort of crevasse had opened up, a pit filled only with darkness, save where something gleamed in the dull light from Terra's star. Something was inside. Furrowing her temporal fins, Avali steered down towards the crevasse, activating the bioluminescent headlamps of the drone to try and see what was inside. As she drew near to the entrance, her connection to the drone faltered and her vision blurred. She had just enough time to see something smooth and gray a great distance down the crevasse before the drone's neurons shorted out entirely and her connection to it disappeared. Avali sat up from the piloting couch suddenly, nursing her aching head.
What happened? Don't tell me you lost another one of my drones, you dumb sapien!
Yngram clicked at her, his mandibles frothing to show his displeasure. I'm uncertain, Avali muttered. Something severed my connection. Something subterranean.
Subterranean? You tried to take it underground?
Yngram sputtered.
Unbelievable! The one thing I told you not to do when you did it anyways! You sapiens really are animals, you know that?
Be still,
Icthoc ordered sharply, and skittered across the room to look down at Avali admonishingly.
Report your findings, Chronicler.
Avali took a deep breath, wishing she could just go back to her quarters and uncork a fresh bottle of C.T. Roy ink for her head. I didn't take the drone under the surface of the moon, officer. There was an open crevasse from the seismic activity earlier this rotation. I brought the drone to surface level to investigate. Something severed my connection before I reached ground level. Something, deliberate, I think. I didn't fizz out and disconnect. It was like something chopped through my link.
Did you see anything inside the crevasse worth investigating?
Icthoc spoke dismissively, but Avali knew he was craving some excitement as much as anyone. 4 cycles of dull monotony left them all hoping that something would just happen. Yes, officer, something was inside the crevasse, something reflective. I estimate 300 links under the surface.
Human?
Impossible to say, officer, but I think it is worth investigating. If this is a human ruin or historical landmark, it is my duty to the Archaeohistorical Society to—
I've heard enough. Clearly this crevasse needs to be explored thoroughly, if for no other reason than to retrieve the lost drone. Yngram, prepare the shuttle for launch. I will inform the rest of the team.
Icthoc left and Avali followed as Yngram began loudly complaining. She couldn't even bring herself to be annoyed at him. Her head still throbbed. She resolved to fetch that C.T. Roy ink from her quarters in the short time before the exploratory crew would disembark. Despite her headache, she was excited. This was what she had come here to do, uncover secret histories or long-buried treasures of the ancient past. The exploratory crew would consist of Avali, Yngram, Icthoc, and Arte. Bolston's culinary skills wouldn't be much use on this little expedition, and Barrim would remain at the base to monitor their progress and record anything they found. This mission had the potential to uncover something that the Archaeohistorian Society would reward them lavishly for. Avali donned her vacuum survival suit quickly, slipping into the gelatinous mass and feeling it mold its slippery, insulated body around the contours of her own. The suit wasn't alive in the same sense as a plant or animal, but the inside was webbed with a network of interconnected neurons programmed to perform a series of simple tasks, such as cycling her body heat to keep her warm in the vacuum, and providing a comfortable layer of fluid for her amphibious body to nuzzle in. For the more aquatically inclined nautilins, the suit would recycle their bodily fluids into breathable water. She met the rest of the team in the shuttle hangar after downing nearly the entire bottle of C.T. Roy ink. Her headache was clearing up nicely, and Avali had been quick to bring her journal and carving pen with her. They could be making history today. She noted that her fellow teammates had prepared accordingly as well. Arte was wearing a set of fleshy geologist lenses over the faceplate of her helmet and carrying a set of excavation tools, both robust and delicate. Whatever was underneath the moon would require careful examination of its structure and composition. Yngram was pacing about angrily on 6 scuttling legs, the red stripe of his pilot suit setting him apart from the rest of the team. Multiple neural ports along the length of his central nervous system would let him jack directly into the shuttle for the greatest amount of control. She also noted that he had brought a service weapon as well, an acid pistol with 2 extra cartridges of powerful anti-armor ammunition. Icthoc was much more heavily armed, sporting his full combat kit of seam armor, nerve gun, acid gun, and concussion module. Avali wasn't sure what he expected to run into down there. It could hardly be dangerous outside of environmental hazards, but she didn't bother pointing that out. Poor Icthoc had been itching to see action since they'd been assigned here, and for the most part, he'd had very little to do, save run training drills in the base's automated gym. Avali guessed that by now, he was as well drilled as the staunchest of hegemony soldiers. They filed into the shuttle quietly, leaving behind the other members of the team. Bolston and Yngram shared a loving nuzzle before the pilot crawled aboard the shuttle and lay down in the cockpit. The fleshy harness wrapped itself around him, and Avali felt the shuttle rumble to life. Ingram's voice boomed out all around them as his brain synced with the shuttle's nervous system and gave consciousness to the brain-dead thing.
Everyone strap in. Let's get this drone and be done with the whole mess.
Avali took her place in one of the passenger sacks on the inner lining of the shuttle's midsection. It was dark inside, and she couldn't see much of anything as Yngram began making the proper pre-flight checks.
So, Aval,
Arte spoke from her own sack, voice transmitting privately over.
once we're next on leave, I was wondering if you'd be interested in coming to Terra with me. There's this recreational center on the lower hemisphere that serves the best protein-carbon mixes. They use authentic ingredients from Terra's local wildlife, and I promise you've never had anything like it.
I don't know, Avali replied coyly, happy that Arte couldn't see from here the way her temporal fins fluttered with barely contained mirth. I was planning on doing some studying of the old human ruins on Continent 4. Arte let out an exasperated exhale.
Again? Come on! You've been spending all your time looking at ruins and half-rotten volumes about humans. It's about time you did something fun. Besides, there's also this worker at the rec center who's absolutely compatible with you. You'll like him, I'm positive.
I didn't find the last 3 other sapiens you tried to set me up with terribly interesting.
Well, would you just trust me on this one?
Belay that chatter.
Icthoc barked harshly.
Barrim, confirm communication channels remain open.
I'm positively salivating at the thought of what you'll find.
Barrim replied dryly.
Prep a drone to bring my field report back to the Archaeohistorian Society.
Icthoc always had a poor grasp of sarcasm.
Oh, joy.
Barrim closed his side of the communications channel at that, and Yngram chimed in.
Pre-flight checks are done. Everyone better be strapped in back there.
The shuttle lurched suddenly, and Avali felt them lifting off of the shuttle bay's floor. The jaws of the base's airlock would be opening up, and they would be out on the surface of the moon in moments. Keying the glands on the inside of her sac, Avali activated the visualizer associated with the shuttle's eyes and watched the world fill in around her. They were rising out of the base, the shuttle's pressurized circulatory systems firing short bursts of compressed gas at Ingram's command to steady their flight in the low gravity. The trip to the crevasse was short and uneventful. Avali chatted idly with Arte, Icthoc was quiet, likely meditating, and Yngram would occasionally yell at them all to shut up so he could concentrate. The atmosphere was casual and warm, though charged with anticipation of what they'd find.
Approaching the crevasse. I think I can see the tail end of my drone wedged in some of those rocks there.
Yngram reported.
If you broke it, Avali, you'll be paying for it.
Barrim, this is Icthoc. Confirm comms are still online?
Yeah, somehow in the last 20 minutes, nothing's happened.
Barrim's voice was as bored as ever.
I want you to keep checking the connection as we approach the crevasse. Something blocked Avali's link to her drone.
My drone.
Yngram interrupted.
And I want to know if the same thing happens to us.
Look, I'll keep checking, boss, but I'm telling you, all the readings are completely
The broadcast shorted out suddenly.
Barrim? Barrim, do you copy?
Icthoc let out a hiss of irritation and clicked his mandibles.
Right. Yngram, let's recover the drone and then head back. We need to figure out what's causing this communication error before exploring what's down there.
Already doing it.
Yngram replied. Avali felt the shuttle shudder, and Yngram extended its manipulator limb out to try to grasp the tail section of the biodrone and lift it free. Avali felt a rush of disappointment upon realizing that she wouldn't get the chance to explore the crevasse just yet, but she knew better than to question Icthoc's decision. Once he made his mind up, he was impossible to budge on it. Yngram let out a frustrated sputter.
It's stuck fast on something. I'm gonna take us around to try and budge it from inside the crevasse.
Make it quick. There's no telling what Barrim is getting up to back at base.
Arte laughed.
Neural net restrictions will keep him from accessing pornographic material on base devices.
Icthoc replied.
This is Barrim.
Avali laughed.
He cracked the encoding for the neural net blockers 2 cycles ago. Poor Bolston will be stuck listening to erogenous Gastropo films until we get back.
I'll need to speak with him about proper usage of hegemony property.
Icthoc muttered severely before there was a sudden lurch.
What was that?
Arte spoke with a distinct quaver in her voice. It was no secret that flying had never agreed with her mammalian sensibilities, and it had taken almost the full first solar cycle of their assignment before she would stop bringing up crash statistics or biodrive failures whenever boarding the shuttle. Yngram replied between grunts of effort as he wrestled for control of the vessel.
Something's affecting the shuttle. It started the moment I brought us into the crevasse. Some kind of field?
Do you still have control?
Icthoc's voice remained even, calm. Despite his youth and lack of experience, Avali was impressed by his attitude in the field. A lesser officer would be buckling under the pressure, but Icthoc behaved for all the world as if everything was going according to plan.
Some, sure, but I can't say how long that will last. What in the name of revered Nautil itself is down here?
Could you bring us back up to the surface?
Controls are choppy. If I try to ascend, we might end up a smear on the cavern roof and miss the entrance entirely.
Avali felt a sudden chill as the shuttle lurched, and in the half-light she got a better look than the drone had provided at what lay beneath them. It was a massive reflective surface, like polished stone, yet duller. It formed a large circle in the rock face beneath them, with an enormous wheel in the center and what looked like a basic hinging joint on one side. Runes indecipherable and terrible to look at glared up at her in bold black. The runes she recognized. They were ancient as the long-dead human race. She had studied old human languages to a degree in her free time and recognized that these were letters, symbols representing audible syllables. Without a reference, she couldn't translate them, but seeing them made her heart beat faster. This was a human ruin, and insofar as she could tell, it had remained undiscovered since the war. What lay within could be thousands of years old. "Officer, do you see that?" she asked, interrupting the rest of the crew's debate as to what should be done next.
See what?
"Below us. I recognize those runes as human."
So some old barbarians left their garbage around. Who cares?
Yngram snapped.
Can't this nonsense wait until we're safely back home?
"I think whatever's affecting the shuttle is coming from inside."
Is there a precedent for that?
Icthoc seemed to take her seriously, while Arte practiced deep breaths and muttered devotional psalms to the revered houses to try to calm her nerves. Old war manuscripts speak of a human device called a radio jammer that they often use to disrupt connections between Nautilus ships and their crews. The ranges were short, but this phenomena seems to match the description.
Right. Yngram, take us down. We'll need to head inside that vault to deactivate that device.
Are you out of your mind? We don't know what's in there. It could be...
That is an order from your superior officer, Yngram.
Muttering profanity, Yngram complied, and the shuttle slowly sank down towards the great vault door. The massive runes loomed in Avali's vision, and a mix of excitement and fear rolled in her gut. What would they find? The shuttle wobbled lower, its main appendage reaching out to grasp the edge of the great wheel in the center of the vault. Avali heard the insides of the shuttle creak and groan as Yngram put all of the shuttle's considerable thrusting power into hauling the wheel bodily to one side. The shuttle began to tremble as it strained to one side, and Avali felt her heart quail.
Come on, you stupid piece of...
Yngram cut off with a grunt of surprise as there was an almighty crack and the wheel began to turn. The shuttle lurched sickeningly to one side, nearly careening into the side of the cave wall, but Yngram was able to steady it before they lost control entirely.
Be careful!
Arte squealed, and Avali could only imagine how terrified she must be, curled up into a frightened little ball in her passenger sack.
It's not as easy as it looks, moron!
Yngram snarled, then fell silent as he worked the manipulator arm to keep turning the stubborn wheel. After 3 rotations, a deafening clunk could be heard inside the vault, before the enormous slab began to flex outwards on the hinge. A loud moaning, as if of something alive, rocked the shuttle to its core, and Avali felt her guts lurch as Yngram jerked them back out of the way of the slowly opening vault. The interior was darker than pitch, so black that even the keen bioluminescent eyes of the shuttle could illuminate very little inside.
Right. Take us in.
Icthoc ordered.
I don't like this.
Avali heard Yngram mutter.
We won't stay inside long. Just find the jammer and deactivate it, then we'll re-establish communications with Barrim and return to the base.
Yngram slowly guided them into the blackness, and just as the shuttle crossed the threshold into the vault, a sudden pressure slammed into them.
What the?
Yngram exclaimed as the shuttle careened to one side before slamming into the wall of the vault with a meaty thump. The shuttle's internal systems were shrieking. Arte screamed alongside them, and Icthoc bellowed for all of them to remain calm. Somehow, Avali remained still and thoughtful, her apprehension being replaced with excitement as it dawned on her that untold wonders of the human world could very well remain untouched within this undiscovered place. They were the first Naudilans to enter here in over 3,000 cycles, maybe even the first ever. Artificial gravity. She spoke aloud without meaning to.
What?
Icthoc immediately turned all attention to her. Artificial gravity, Avali stammered. Humans made use of it as a weapon throughout the war to crush our less hardy bodies. Old war records mention a sort of torpedo containing a gravity core powerful enough to crush the hegemony battleship Incursor into the size of a marble. Once they got their forelimbs on hegemony technology, the humans reverse engineered it based off of our tech used to protect against worlds with harmfully high gravity.
So this is a human construct. You're certain?
Almost positive, Avali replied. The runes on the front of the aperture entrance were decidedly human, part of the Latin alphabet, and look around. This material is of human construction.
Some kind of secreted resin?
Arte piped up. Actually, no. Humans had this art using combustion. They'd superheat various minerals until they reached melting point, then mold them into their tools and weapons. From our understanding, this metallurgy was one of the focal points of their entire culture.
Savages,
Yngram muttered.
Incredible.
Icthoc spoke quietly, as if to himself.
I suppose on a world without intelligent aquatic life and high gravity, they had to find some way of overcoming all those predatory species on Terra.
They didn't just overcome them. Avali was warming to the subject quickly. They dominated life on the planet.
Like her symbiosis with the shuttle.
Arte was clearly trying to draw parallels. It was a natural response to learning about a culture so alien and unknown. Not quite. We learned to work with the native creatures of Naudil. My human ancestors didn't. They treated life on their home planet as rivals to be overcome and subjugated. On Naudil, the hegemony rendered the food chain obsolete by creating worldwide symbiosis. On Terra, humanity became the apex of all apex predators. They rose to the top of every food chain, and as they progressed, the gap only widened.
Then we need to be careful exploring this place.
Icthoc spoke with quiet confidence.
There's no telling what safeguards those creatures may have left behind. Yngram, is it safe to disembark?
The shuttle was struggling to lift itself from where it had collided with the wall, but it hadn't been programmed with the necessary load-bearing parameters to compensate for the sudden shift in gravity to multiple times that of the moon. At length, Yngram gave up trying to dislodge it.
Gonna have to shut off that artificial gravity too.
He clicked irritably.
Alright, everybody off. Brace yourselves. This gravity isn't going to feel comfortable.
Avali had been to Terra a number of times, so she expected to be all right as she chambered out of her passenger sack and made her way out through the opening jaws of the shuttle bay, but very nearly flattened herself on the smooth, shiny floor. This gravity was nearly twice that of Terra's by her estimate. The atmosphere around them felt altogether heavy and oppressive with weight, and all of them needed a moment to recuperate as they emerged from the shuttle.
This is unbelievable,
Arte griped.
What kind of insane creature intentionally increases the gravity past their own standard?
Avali didn't know. Icthoc drew out his weapons, the parasitic acid gun slithering onto his left forelimb majoris and latching into the flesh under his suit with long grasping tentacles. The concussion module bonded with the chitinous crown around his forehead, and his right forelimb majoris gripping the shell of the nerve gun. The small creature inside hissed as his fingers manipulated its sensitive underbelly and primed the venomous stingers in his mouth to fire.
I want everyone to stick together and stay alert. Avali, you're the human expert, you take the lead. I'll cover your left, Yngram cover her right. Arte, watch the rear and warn us if you see anything suspicious. Clear?
Clear! All of them replied almost in unison, then formed up around Avali. As they did, the meager sunlight from outside the cavern began to fade, and the vault door, they realized, was shutting. Within moments, it had slammed closed, and the party was left in complete darkness.
Remain calm,
Icthoc instructed.
Did anyone else bring luminescent lenses?
Before anyone could respond, there was a massive rush of air. In a wind of gale-like proportion as strong as any storm, the chamber repressurized. There was a snapping sound, and the chamber was flooded with light, revealing an airlock the size of an entire recreation center, and what appeared to be several derelict ships of human design scattered all around them. From some unknown origin, a booming voice announced something unintelligible in the guttural, rough speech of ancient humanity, then repeated it in multiple different dialects of their strange speech.
What in the name of revered Noddle is this place?
Arte whimpered. Some kind of human installation, Avali murmured.
Yeah, I think we all figured that out, genius.
Yngram snapped at her.
Some archaeohistorian you've turned out to be.
Quiet.
Icthoc demanded.
Any signs of security measures being taken, Avali?
I think if this place didn't want us here, we'd already be dead, she replied candidly.
Good. Everyone remain calm. We've been monitoring seismic activity on this moon for cycles. If any humans were still left alive under here, they'd have been found a long time ago. This is just an old facility they left behind.
This is incredible, Avali breathed. She felt a sudden rush of excitement as it dawned on her the raw enormity of their discovery. If my old Archsire could see this.
Good thing there aren't any humans left. You'd probably have tried to breed with one by now.
Yngram snorted. Avali ignored him. They moved out slowly under the pretense of finding a way to turn off the signal jammer and artificial gravity so they could leave. Avali herself couldn't care less. This was the archaeological discovery to put all others to shame. A completely and perfectly preserved relic of the times before humanity died out. No hegemony propaganda of the times, no having to parse the real history out from the narrative. This was real. The airlock alone took minutes to traverse, each step along the way harried by Avali's excited desire to inspect everything they saw more closely and keep a detailed log in her journal. The carving pen inked out a hastily scribbled tale of their journey, punctuated with rudimentary sketches of bits and pieces of human technology and design. Colored lines covered a floor of poured stone, and everywhere she looked, Avali found messages written in bold, blocky text that she didn't have the resources to decipher. Another large aperture led further into the facility, and the companions pressed in further and further. Panels on the ceiling of the corridors filled with garish yellow light that hummed with power, and Avali explained how humans used captured lighting in place of bioluminescence to power all of their lights. Without her book of human words and phrases, it was near impossible to figure out where the artificial gravity generator and radio jammer were, and they passed through what appeared to be a kind of hydroponics unit and then an armory. Icthoc took particular interest in the racks of portable human weapons hanging on the walls, but couldn't figure out how to make them work. He took one with them anyways, under the pretense of it being for academic purposes. The hydroponics department had been quietly running on its own what must have been reserve power for the last 1,000 cycles, as they soon found a storage area of dried and stored plant matter that the humans would have used for sustenance. Another positively enormous chamber was used as an insect farm of massive proportions, cultivating thousands of small brown-shelled creatures before grinding them up into a nutritious protein paste that was then being fed somewhere. The same could be said of the plant matter, and pipes colored green and red fed hydronium, insect matter, and plant matter to some unknown source, while a steadfast crew of non-living metal drones operated without instruction to keep the facility running. After some more investigation, they found that the base was drawing power from the superheated molten core of the moon, just enough to keep the base running on reserve power. In this department of the base, they found the machines that powered the artificial gravity and the radio jammer, but not controls to shut them off. Yngram was in favor of just destroying the machines, but Avali put up such a stiff resistance, and Icthoc thought that the machines might be too volatile to risk damaging, so they moved on. There was a habitation unit here as well, large enough to house thousands of humans. They spent more than a little time here, Avali taking down notes and copying the strange human runes she saw all around them. The furnishings were sparse and utilitarian, with not a single organism in sight. It was strange seeing so little life all around them. Noddle technology was based entirely around the native life of Noddle. To see not a hint of coral, no organelles or organic apparatus around them was profoundly unsettling. Arte was interested in much of the human art of metallurgy, scraping away samples of the different materials in the base so as to catalog their composition and unique properties when they returned to their own base. It wasn't long before her inventory of sample vials was filled to the brim, and much of her discomfort had been replaced with academic curiosity. With very few areas left to explore, and realizing that it was imperative to check in with the base to let Barrim and Bolston know they were all right, the group approached one of the final areas that yet remained unexplored. The lack of security countermeasures had emboldened Icthoc, and he led the way as they followed the pipelines to where the ground-up slurry of protein and plant matter was being pumped. Another large aperture barred the way, its large wheel lock stuck fast. It required both Yngram, Avali's developed musculature, and Icthoc's seam armor at full power to budget, and as the vault door swung open, they found themselves in another truly massive chamber. A quiet hum filled the area, and they filed in one by one to see what lay inside. Large pods, outfitted with all kinds of attachments and technology, filled the room row after row, and the low-ceiling chambers stretched on so far that Avali couldn't see the end of it.
What are these?
Arte wondered aloud, skittering up to one and sitting back on her forelegs to brush at the cloudy surface on one of them.
Look up there. The pipelines are distributing that protein slurry to every single pod.
Icthoc pointed out. It was true. Their pipes branched into dozens upon dozens of smaller tubes, eating down into each and every one of the thousands of pods. Avali felt a sudden, cold stone of fear lodge in her stomach as it dawned on her what these pods contained. Arte, get away from it! She shouted suddenly, startling the other Nautilin and making her scramble backwards. It was far too late. Another booming pre-recorded message from the automated systems of the facility filled the air, and before their eyes, the cloudy fluid filling the pod Arte touched drained away. Inside was a thing out of Nautil's most terrifying history. The greatest foe the hegemony had ever faced floated before them, suspended. Avali recognized the technology as derivative of their own, only absolutely ancient by modern standards. The human's mouth was plugged with a long tube that would provide it with that nutritious insect and plant paste. The cloudy fluid she had seen filling the pod had been nanotechnology, organic machinery designed to constantly repair and prevent cellular degeneration. Another tube sticking into the creature's forelimb intravenously supplied a drug to keep it in an induced coma. For thousands of years it had remained here, sleeping. Now, she realized with budding horror, this ancient terror was waking up.
Get behind me!
Icthoc bellowed at her as he and Yngram moved protectively in front of Avali and Arte, who had scrambled back to the rest of the group as the pod's transparent front panel slid down into the floor. With a gurgle, the tube down the human's throat retracted, followed by the tube in its arm. A short mechanical arm extended from the inner wall of the pod to the human's neck, where some unknown substance was quickly injected therein, and the clamps holding the human's massive body in place released. Avali marveled at it as it dropped to the floor, already groggily beginning to awaken, coughing and spluttering. It was, in the most basic silhouette, similar to herself. It was clearly meant to stand upright like her, only instead of balancing on 4 prehensile hind limbs, it stood on thick, multi-jointed legs, wrapped in muscle that bunched powerfully as it convulsed. Its pelvis and torso were similar to hers, its sex organ clearly denoting it as male, only rather than Avali's pectoral majoris and minori, it had just 2 broad, meaty pectorals, framed by wide, powerful shoulders. No breasts upon its chest like she had, but Avali supposed that was more due to its sex than a species difference. It had no furrows into it which could fold its forelimbs for swimming, but instead a barreled chest supported by what appeared to be an armored cage of calcium-based gravity-hardened bone. Not 4 limbs like her, but 2, thick and roped with veins. Now Avali understood the purpose of the high gravity in this place. Human warriors like this must have used the increased stress on their bodies to train themselves to become even stronger, even faster. Somehow, even after thousands of years of potential atrophy, this monster was still 100 times stronger than any Nautilin could hope to be. Its skin was a light shade of pink and dusted with faint vestigial fur so thin it may as well not be there at all. Its head was like Avali's in so many ways it was uncanny, though there were marked differences. It only had one nose pointing downwards from the fulcrum between its eyes, while Avali possessed 6 branching out in a star shape around her eyes. Its lips were thinner and less voluptuous than hers, and its head was shaven bald, revealing a smooth, unadorned scalp fitted to the contours of its dense skull. Strange fleshy cups surrounded the holes where Avali's auditory senses were housed and her own coiffed layers of temporal fins. It was, Avali realized, breathtaking, somehow encapsulating a sort of primal, brutal grace in its design that just felt right to look upon. Icthoc took aim with his nerve gun as the human slowly raised itself up on its forelimbs and the joints of its legs. If it was standing upright, Avali realized that it would dwarf her, standing almost 2 full heads taller despite its native gravity being much greater than her own. It made a heaving noise and spasmed, vomiting up a thick black fluid. Its whole body convulsed as it reached, and Icthoc seemed to regain some confidence.
Hold, creature!
He barked with all the authority of a hegemony princeps.
In the name of the Nautilin hegemony, you are under arrest.
He stopped abruptly as the human jerked its head up to meet his gaze. Nautilin and ancient human gazed into each other, and what Avali saw in the human's eyes made her quail. Its eyes were black-pupiled, ringed with a piercing blue iris on a field of white. Somehow in its gaze, Avali saw all the rage and hate of a being forced from its planet. 1,000 cycles of fury lay behind those eyes, and she realized as she watched those vengeful eyes that they were all about to die.
Don't try anything, beast.
Yngram scuttled forwards, leveling his acid gun at the thing and leering at it.
You'll still be experiencing stasis sickness from that primitive egg you call technology. You won't even be able to stand, let alone fight.
He trailed off as the beast's face twisted into a snarl of such ancient and primordial disgust that Avali felt a rush of shame for daring to exist in the same place as this thing. It bellowed, a spiteful war cry in its growling, guttural tongue, its hoarse voice filling the chamber with echoes of its malice, and without warning it surged to its feet. Yngram barely had time to scream as the human slammed its dense, compact body into him. Avali heard Ingram's exoskeleton crunch as the human's body weight slammed into him and bored him to the ground. A sickening splatter echoed out as Ingram's corpse, dead in moments, squelched into a paste, and the human rolled gracelessly to its feet, not pausing for a moment. Arte screamed. It was already charging Yngram, who fired off 2 quick shots for the nerve gun. The pneumatocytes launched from the gun and struck the human square in the chest. A rush of venom should have rendered the human completely paralyzed as his nerves overloaded. The nerve gun had been keyed up to its highest setting. Instead, the human only roared again, legs like pistons launching it at Icthoc. The poor security officer tried to bring his acid gun to bear, but too slow. As Arte scooted away, squealing in terror, and Avali staggered to the side, the human reached Icthoc and grabbed 2 of his forelimbs. Icthoc powered up the concussion module, blasting a solid punch of kinetic force from it to try and daze the beast. The human remained almost completely unfazed, more furious than hurt, though a purplish bruise was forming on its jaw where the blow struck. Icthoc clawed at the thing's chest with his free forelimbs, scoring a few deep gouges that leaked crimson blood. The human bellowed war cries into Icthoc's face as it rocketed its forehead into him. Once, twice, 3 times, until its hardened skull of calcium shattered the brittle chitin of Icthoc's face, and the Nautilin stumbled, dazed. The human planted 1 flat foot against Icthoc's chest and hauled as hard as it could. Avali watched the muscles straining and bunching in its forelimbs as it hauled, then a fleshy ripping and tearing noise filled the chamber, and in a spurt of thick yellow blood 2 of Icthoc's limbs tore off, his seam armor almost no protection at all against the human's raw strength. Avali felt the world slow down as Icthoc collapsed, dying, and Arte lifted Ingram's discarded acid gun to train it on the human. It isn't just powerful, she realized as she watched it, spattered in Icthoc and Ingram's lifeblood, turn to face Arte. It is power. Arte fired off a spurt of powerful acid, the shot splashing against the human's chest and lower jaw. It shrieked in anguish and pain, shuddering and taking 2 steps back as the flesh of its chest began to dissolve into goop. A hissing sound filled the air, and a sickening, pungent smell flooded Avali's noses. The human gurgled in anguish, its lower jawbone dropping to the floor as the acid ate at it. Avali saw its exposed bones gleaming in the electric light, and Arte stepped forward to fire again. The human's hand shot out, slapping fingers grasping at Arte's head and drawing her into it in a parody of an embrace. Avali knew she should do something, try to run or help Arte, and yet she remained frozen in terror, unable to do anything but watch. Arte fired a second, third, fourth blast into the human's midsection as it squeezed her head between its head. Its abdomen liquefied, organs dripping out of its chest cavity, and yet it just didn't stop. Even as its eyes clouded over in the throes of death, it squeezed and squeezed. It squeezed as Arte thrashed in its grip, blunted claws failing to dislodge its hands, and the hissing of its dissolving innards accompanied by the creaking of Arte's fragile skull bones beginning to fracture.
Avali! Avali! Help me! Avali! Help me!
She managed to choke out. A gut-wrenching splatter as her skull caved and brains coated the human's forelimbs. Avali was alone with it. The human stumbled, dying, and Avali trembled as it turned to gaze at her. She clutched the journal to her breast as if it could protect her, forelimbs majoris held up to ward off the thing. Please, she whimpered pathetically, perspiration dripping down her face. The human took 2 steps towards her, stumbling, body falling apart. It gurgled something out, perhaps trying to speak, and then it died, dropping to the floor with a thud, its rage finally spent. She was alive. Avali wept, great heaving sobs of relief and horror at what had become of her friends. Tears of relief at the terrible fate that she had been spared. Tears of shame for having been too frightened to even try to fight back. These things, they were really her ancestors? The people she was descended from? How? How had the hegemony ever managed to defeat so terrible a foe? A single one of them, naked, sick, groggy after thousands of cycles of sleep, had tore through 3 Nautilians armed with hyper-advanced acid weapons. They had been nothing to it. Less than nothing. Prey. Avali stood there, one, trembling, uncertain what to do next. Could she fly the shuttle herself? She'd never been trained for it, and that signal jammer was still active. Where were the controls to disable it? What would she tell Bolston about Yngram? She didn't have to wonder for long. A chorus of pneumatic hisses filled the air. 1,000 pods began to drain of fluid. They had not woken a single human. They had woken all of them. 1,000 cycles worth of wrath waited inside those pods. Males, females, perhaps even children. Hate fueled by the humiliation and pain of having their homes stolen, their people raped, families torn asunder by a race of Xenos that barely saw them as anything more than desirable traits to be harvested for their own future generations. She began to laugh as the first of the avenging humans began to drop from their pods. Humanity was awake, humanity was hungry, and the universe would burn.